1 in 5 American adults cannot read at a functional level. Classrooms are losing teachers faster than they can replace them. And almost no one wants to talk about the real reason why. Because fixing this crisis would require admitting that something foundational has been broken for decades. Please like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment the next video topic in the comments. Right now, in the United States, something is happening that most people never talk about out loud. More than 1 in 5 adults struggles to read at a functional level. That does not mean they cannot recognize words at all. It means reading is slow, exhausting, and often avoided. It means long forms, instructions, medical paperwork, contracts, and even basic written information feel overwhelming. It means reading is not a tool. It is a barrier. What makes this even harder to notice is that modern life allows people to hide it. Phones read things out loud. Videos explain what text used to. Forms autofill. Maps talk instead of showing directions. Many people move through life without ever having to confront the fact that reading is difficult for them. But the consequences are still there. Lower wages, fewer job options, poor health outcomes, higher stress, less confidence, more dependence on others. And the most alarming part is this: the problem is growing, not shrinking. Students today are entering adulthood with weaker reading skills than previous generations. Teachers are sounding alarms. Employers are noticing. Colleges are adjusting expectations downward. Yet the public conversation barely scratches the surface. This did not happen because people stopped caring about education. It happened because reading itself was quietly redefined. And once that change took hold, everything that followed was almost inevitable. To understand how the United States reached this point, we need to go back to the moment reading instruction shifted away from how the brain actually learns language. For most of modern history, reading instruction was based on a simple idea. Written language is a code. Letters represent sounds. Sounds blend together. Words form meaning. This approach treats reading as a skill that must be built step by step. It assumes struggle is part of learning. It assumes mistakes are information, not failure. Children were taught how to sound out unfamiliar words. They were encouraged to decode, not guess. Over time, decoding became automatic, freeing the brain to focus on meaning instead of mechanics. This method did not produce instant fluency. It required repetition. It required practice. It required patience from both teachers and students. But it worked. Readers trained this way could approach new words confidently because they understood the system underneath the text. They did not rely on memory alone. They relied on structure. Then the philosophy around learning began to change. Struggle started to be viewed as harmful. Frustration was framed as something to avoid. Learning was expected to feel smooth and enjoyable at all times. And reading instruction changed to reflect that belief. Educators began searching for ways to make reading feel more natural, more intuitive, and less demanding. Instead of breaking words into sounds, children were encouraged to recognize whole words by sight. Context became more important than decoding. Pictures were used as clues. Guessing was reframed as strategy. If a child came to an unfamiliar word, they were told to skip it, look at the picture, and keep going. At first, the results looked promising. Young children appeared to read fluently. They could recite familiar texts. They could predict words based on patterns. They moved through early books quickly. But this fluency was fragile. It depended on memorization, repetition, and visual cues. It did not transfer well to new material. The problem was not obvious at first because early reading material is intentionally simple. Vocabulary is limited. Sentences repeat. Pictures do much of the work. As long as the text stayed predictable, the illusion held. But reading does not stay predictable forever. Around third grade, the structure of school changes. Up until that point, students are taught how to read. After that point, they are expected to read in order to learn. The pictures disappear. Vocabulary becomes more complex. Sentences grow longer. Information density increases. For students who never learned to decode fluently, this transition is devastating. Reading becomes slow and mentally exhausting. Comprehension drops because all available mental energy is spent simply recognizing words. Subjects that once felt manageable suddenly feel impossible. This is not a motivation problem. It is a cognitive overload problem. When the brain is forced to guess instead of decode, it works much harder and understands much less. Students fall behind quickly. Confidence erodes. Anxiety increases. Some begin to act out. Others withdraw completely. And because school moves forward regardless, many never catch up. Children who struggle with reading do not usually announce it. They develop coping strategies. They memorize passages instead of understanding them. They rely on classmates. They avoid reading aloud. They choose courses that require less reading. They learn how to pass without mastering. By adulthood, these strategies become habits. Many adults with low literacy are highly intelligent. They are capable workers. They function well in hands-on or verbal environments. But reading remains a source of quiet stress. They skim instead of read. They avoid paperwork. They delay tasks involving text. They feel shame about something they were never properly taught. And because technology fills the gaps, the problem stays hidden. But hiding does not mean healing. At the same time reading instruction weakened, digital technology exploded. Screens reward speed. Reading requires patience. Screens encourage constant novelty. Reading demands sustained focus. The brain adapts to what it practices. When attention is trained on short bursts of stimulation, long-form reading feels uncomfortable. Not boring. Uncomfortable. Many adults say they want to read more, but cannot concentrate long enough to do it. This is not a lack of discipline. It is a predictable outcome of attention conditioning. Children raised in this environment face an even steeper challenge. They are asked to learn reading, a slow and effortful skill, in a culture that discourages slowness and effort. And this tension plays out every day inside classrooms. Teachers see the results before anyone else. Students arrive without basic reading foundations. Classrooms include a wide range of abilities. Expectations remain high, but support is often limited. Teachers are asked to differentiate instruction, manage behavior, meet testing benchmarks, and provide emotional support simultaneously. When students struggle, teachers are expected to fix problems rooted in years of systemic decisions. This creates chronic stress. Progress feels slow. Wins feel rare. Accountability remains constant. And over time, many teachers decide the cost is too high. Low literacy feeds disengagement. Disengagement fuels behavior problems. Behavior problems push teachers out. Teacher shortages weaken instruction. Weakened instruction lowers expectations. Lower expectations produce another generation of struggling readers. This loop does not correct itself. It accelerates unless deliberately interrupted. And that brings us to the question most people avoid. Is this crisis inevitable? Or is it the result of choices that can be changed? That question is where the next part begins. To understand why American literacy declined so sharply, you have to understand something uncomfortable. The people who designed modern reading instruction were not malicious. They were not trying to make children worse readers. In many cases, they genuinely believed they were making reading easier, more humane, and more inclusive. But good intentions do not protect against bad outcomes. And when it comes to reading, small instructional changes can shape an entire lifetime. The shift away from phonics did not happen overnight. It happened quietly, slowly, and with very little public scrutiny. And once it became the dominant method, reversing it became incredibly difficult. The core belief behind whole-word reading instruction sounds appealing at first. The idea is that reading should feel natural, the way spoken language does. Instead of breaking words into parts, children should recognize them as complete units. Meaning should come first. Context should guide understanding. On paper, it feels intuitive. After all, when adults read fluently, they do not consciously sound out every word. They recognize words instantly. Whole-word advocates assumed that if children were exposed to enough text, this recognition would emerge naturally. So classrooms shifted their focus. Children were taught to memorize common words by sight. They were encouraged to look at pictures. They were told to guess unfamiliar words based on surrounding sentences. If a word made sense, it was often accepted as correct even if it was wrong. Reading became an exercise in prediction rather than decoding. And in the earliest grades, this approach appeared to work. Young children learning to read often work with short books filled with repetition and images. The sentence structures are simple. The vocabulary is limited. Pictures do most of the storytelling. In this environment, memorization looks like reading. A child can read an entire book simply by remembering patterns and using images as cues. Teachers see progress. Parents see confidence. Schools report success. But this success is fragile. It depends entirely on familiarity. The moment text becomes unfamiliar, the strategy collapses. True reading is transferable. Guessing is not. But by the time this becomes obvious, years have already passed. Spoken language is natural. Reading is not. Humans evolved to speak. We did not evolve to decode symbols on a page. Reading requires the brain to build new neural pathways that connect visual symbols to sounds and meaning. This process is effortful. It requires explicit instruction and repetition. When phonics is skipped or minimized, the brain is forced to compensate. Instead of decoding, it relies on memory, context, and pattern recognition. This uses far more mental energy and breaks down under pressure. Strong readers use phonics even when they do not realize it. The process becomes automatic, not absent. Weak readers never reach that automatic stage. They are always guessing. Guessing works just well enough to pass early grades. That is why the problem stayed hidden for so long. A student can guess their way through simple texts. They can participate in class. They can appear engaged. They can even score adequately on early assessments. But guessing is cognitively expensive. Every sentence requires prediction. Every unfamiliar word becomes a problem. Comprehension slows. Fatigue sets in quickly. As material becomes more complex, the cracks widen. This is why so many students experience a sudden academic collapse instead of a gradual decline. They did not forget how to read. They were never actually reading in the first place. Standardized testing played a role in masking the issue. Many reading tests emphasize comprehension over decoding. Students can answer questions correctly by understanding the general idea of a passage, even if they misread individual words. Multiple choice formats allow for guessing. Short passages do not reveal stamina problems. As long as students performed adequately on paper, the system moved forward. Teachers who noticed deeper issues often lacked the authority or resources to challenge district-wide approaches. And over time, the method became institutionalized. Questioning reading instruction did not remain a purely educational debate. It became ideological. Whole-word methods were often framed as progressive, student-centered, and emotionally supportive. Phonics was sometimes portrayed as rigid, outdated, or even harmful. Teachers who raised concerns risked being labeled resistant to change. Parents who questioned outcomes were told their concerns were anecdotal. This created a culture where results mattered less than alignment. And when outcomes worsened, explanations shifted away from instruction itself. As reading levels declined, responsibility subtly shifted. Students were labeled unmotivated. Families were blamed for lack of support. Poverty was cited as the primary cause, even though literacy declines appeared across income levels. Technology was blamed, but rarely in connection with instructional weaknesses. Rarely did institutions publicly admit that the foundational method itself might be flawed. Changing instruction would require retraining teachers, rewriting curricula, and admitting decades of mistakes. That kind of accountability is rare. The result was a long period where warning signs were visible but unaddressed. Graduation rates were maintained. Standards were adjusted. Expectations softened. Students were passed forward without mastery. This created a generation of adults who completed school without fully acquiring one of its most essential skills. And once adulthood arrives, remediation becomes far more difficult. Children have structured time for learning. Adults do not. Children are expected to struggle. Adults feel shame when they do. Children receive instruction. Adults are expected to already know. Many adults with low literacy avoid situations that expose their difficulty. They rely on verbal explanations. They use technology to bypass text. They choose jobs that minimize reading. But avoidance reinforces the problem. Without intervention, the gap remains for life. Low literacy affects more than reading. It affects employment, health outcomes, civic participation, financial stability. People who struggle to read are less likely to understand contracts, medical instructions, or legal rights. They are more vulnerable to mistakes and exploitation. This is not a personal failure. It is a systems failure, and it feeds directly into the next crisis. Because when students struggle, teachers absorb the pressure. And when teachers absorb too much pressure, they leave. That story is next. The collapse of literacy did not happen in isolation. It happened alongside another crisis that feeds it directly: the quiet breakdown of the teaching profession. For decades, teaching was framed as a stable, respectable career built on patience, purpose, and long-term impact. It was demanding, but manageable. Stress existed, but it was balanced by autonomy, community respect, and clear expectations. That balance no longer exists. Today, teachers are leaving faster than colleges can replace them, and those who remain are carrying workloads that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. This is not a story about individual weakness. It is a story about structural overload. Most people imagine teaching as it was when they were students, standing at the front of a classroom, delivering lessons, grading papers, helping kids learn. That version of teaching barely exists anymore. Modern teachers are expected to be instructors, counselors, data analysts, behavior specialists, crisis managers, and tech support all at once. Each new responsibility was added with good intentions. None came with time removed. One of the biggest shifts was the rise of continuous evaluation. Teachers are now measured not just on whether students learn, but on how quickly they learn, how they test, how they behave, how they feel, and how well the teacher documents every step. Lesson plans must align with standards. Standards must align with benchmarks. Benchmarks must align with assessments. Assessments must align with reports. Reports must align with administrative goals. The paperwork never ends, and most of it does not directly improve instruction. Many teachers now spend more time documenting teaching than actually teaching. Every lesson must be justified. Every intervention must be logged. Every behavior must be recorded. Every accommodation must be tracked. This creates a constant sense of surveillance. Teachers are rarely trusted to use professional judgment without evidence attached. Over time, this erodes morale, because it signals that experience is less valuable than compliance. At the same time, classroom behavior has changed in ways that make teaching far more difficult. Disruptions are more frequent. Attention spans are shorter. Emotional regulation is weaker. In some environments, violent behavior has become disturbingly common. This does not mean students are worse people. It means they are growing up in environments with higher stress, more screen exposure, less structure, and fewer consequences. Teachers are expected to absorb the impact of all of this, often without support. One of the most demoralizing changes for teachers is the erosion of authority. Many school systems reduce disciplinary measures in an effort to be more inclusive and restorative. In theory, this approach emphasizes understanding and growth. In practice, it often leaves teachers powerless. When disruptive behavior carries few consequences, it spreads. When teachers are blamed for classroom chaos they cannot control, burnout accelerates. This creates a paradox where teachers are held responsible for outcomes they are not allowed to influence. Teaching has always involved emotional labor, but the intensity has increased. Teachers now support students dealing with trauma, instability, anxiety, and behavioral challenges on a daily basis. They are expected to be emotionally present while suppressing their own stress. Unlike other professions with emotional labor, teachers rarely receive formal recovery time or mental health support. The work follows them home. The stress accumulates. Eventually, something gives. Despite rising expectations, compensation has lagged behind. In many regions, teachers earn wages that do not reflect their education level or workload. They pay out of pocket for supplies. They work unpaid hours. They absorb criticism from parents, administrators, and the public. For younger teachers especially, the math no longer works. Student debt, rising living costs, and stagnant wages make long-term commitment unrealistic. Passion alone cannot sustain a career. Teaching has also become politicized. Curriculum choices are scrutinized. Lesson content is challenged. Teachers are caught between competing demands from parents, administrators, and lawmakers. No matter what they do, someone is dissatisfied. This creates a constant sense of risk. One misinterpreted lesson can escalate into public conflict. This pressure discourages creativity, honesty, and engagement, and it pushes many educators to quietly exit. Some argue that teacher shortages can be solved by hiring more people. But teaching is not easily replaced. It requires training, classroom management skills, emotional resilience, and subject mastery. When experienced teachers leave, institutional knowledge disappears. New teachers are often placed in the most difficult environments with the least support. Many leave within the first few years. This creates a revolving door, and instability harms students the most. Low literacy increases classroom stress. Struggling readers require more attention. Lessons move slower. Behavior issues rise. Teachers feel pressure to meet standards that students are not prepared to meet. This creates frustration on both sides. The system responds by adding more interventions, more documentation, and more oversight, which increases burnout, which increases turnover, which worsens outcomes. The cycle feeds itself. Veteran teachers carry something that cannot be taught quickly. They know how to read a room. They know when to push and when to pause. They know how to adapt instruction instinctively. When they leave, schools lose stability. New teachers are left without mentors. Students lose continuity. Communities lose trust. This is not a short-term fluctuation. It is a structural shift. Unless working conditions improve, literacy instruction improves, and teacher authority is restored, the profession will continue to shrink. And without teachers, reform is impossible. No curriculum works without people who can deliver it. No policy succeeds without trust. If literacy decline and teacher burnout continue unchecked, the consequences extend far beyond classrooms. They reach the workforce. They reach democracy. They reach public health and economic stability. The next part explores those consequences. How low literacy reshapes adulthood. How it limits opportunity. And how it quietly fractures society in ways that are difficult to reverse. Low literacy does not announce itself loudly. It does not always look like someone who cannot read at all. Most of the time, it looks like struggle that stays hidden. Adults who read poorly often develop ways to avoid situations that expose it. They memorize routines. They rely on others. They choose jobs that minimize reading. They avoid paperwork, contracts, and long forms. They skim and guess. This allows them to function, but it also traps them. Many adults labeled as literate can read simple sentences, but struggle with longer texts, instructions, or abstract language. They can recognize words, but not fully process meaning. They can read slowly, but not efficiently. They can decode, but comprehension breaks down under pressure. This gap between appearance and reality makes the problem harder to detect and harder to fix. Modern economies are built on information. Even entry-level jobs now require reading instructions, following written policies, completing digital training, and communicating in writing. Low literacy narrows options. It pushes people into unstable work. It limits promotion. It reduces bargaining power. Workers who struggle to read contracts are more likely to accept unfavorable terms. Workers who struggle with forms are more likely to miss benefits. Workers who struggle with written communication are more likely to be overlooked. This creates a permanent ceiling. Low literacy increases daily stress. Simple tasks take longer. Mistakes are more common. Bills are misunderstood. Deadlines are missed. Instructions are misread. This constant friction drains energy. Over time, it erodes confidence. People stop trying to advance because failure feels inevitable. This is not a lack of ambition. It is learned avoidance. Healthcare is heavily text-based. Prescriptions, consent forms, insurance paperwork, appointment instructions. Patients with low literacy are more likely to misunderstand medication dosages. They are more likely to miss follow-up care. They are more likely to delay treatment. This leads to worse health outcomes, higher emergency care usage, higher long-term costs. The system becomes more expensive and less effective for everyone. Many assume technology would solve literacy gaps. Instead, it often hides them. Apps replace reading with icons. Autofill replaces comprehension. Voice assistants reduce the need to decode text. At first, this feels helpful, but it prevents practice. Skills weaken without use. And when complexity returns, the gap is larger than before. Digital systems also assume literacy. Error messages, policy updates, security notices. When users cannot fully understand them, risk increases. Democracy relies on reading, understanding ballots, evaluating arguments, recognizing manipulation. Low literacy makes people more vulnerable to misinformation. Simplified slogans replace nuanced understanding. Emotion overrides analysis. People disengage or become easily swayed. This weakens civic participation without anyone noticing. Voter turnout declines. Trust erodes. Polarization increases. By adulthood, shame has often replaced curiosity. People avoid admitting difficulty. Adult education programs exist, but participation is low. Time constraints. Fear of embarrassment. Lack of access. Many adults carry the belief that it is too late. That belief is powerful. and it keeps the cycle going. Parents with low literacy often struggle to support their children's reading. They avoid reading aloud. They avoid helping with homework. They rely on schools to handle everything. This is not neglect. It is discomfort. Children sense it, and the cycle repeats. Low literacy reduces productivity. It increases healthcare costs. It increases reliance on social services. It reduces innovation. It increases inequality. These costs compound over decades. They are not dramatic. They are persistent, and they are difficult to reverse once embedded. The world is becoming more complex, not less. Contracts are longer. Systems are more automated. Information is constant. Those who cannot navigate text are increasingly dependent. Dependence reduces autonomy, and autonomy is the foundation of opportunity. Understanding the damage is not enough. The next part explores what can actually reverse these trends. What works, what does not, and why meaningful improvement requires changing both instruction and expectations. If low literacy were easy to fix, it would already be fixed. The problem is not a lack of awareness. It is a failure of execution, incentives, and honesty. Every decade brings a new reform, a new framework, a new promise. Yet reading outcomes remain stubbornly flat. To understand why, we have to confront uncomfortable truths about how change really happens in education. Most reading reforms failed because they focused on theory instead of results. They prioritized philosophy over evidence. They emphasized student comfort over mastery. Programs were adopted because they sounded humane, progressive, or innovative, not because they reliably taught children to read. Once implemented, they became politically protected. Admitting failure meant admitting harm. So systems doubled down instead. Reading is not natural. Speaking is natural. Reading is learned. It requires explicit instruction. It requires repetition. It requires correction. No amount of exposure alone will reliably teach most children to read well. This is not opinion. It is reality. When instruction avoids this truth, students pay the price. Successful literacy instruction is structured. It teaches letter sounds directly. It builds from simple to complex. It practices decoding daily. It connects sounds to meaning deliberately. It does not assume children will discover patterns on their own. This approach works across socioeconomic groups. It works across languages. It works across learning styles. But it requires discipline. And discipline is often misunderstood as cruelty. No curriculum can overcome low expectations. When schools assume certain students cannot succeed, instruction adapts downward. Texts are simplified. Mistakes are overlooked. Progress is redefined. This creates the illusion of inclusion while guaranteeing long-term failure. High expectations are not harsh. They are protective. They signal belief. And belief shapes effort. Reading proficiency requires volume. Daily reading, guided reading, independent reading, repeated exposure. Yet many classrooms have reduced reading time in favor of testing, screen-based activities, or behavioral management. Time spent reading has been replaced with time spent measuring reading. This inversion is catastrophic. Fixing schools alone is not enough. Millions of adults are already locked out. Adult literacy programs must be normalized. They must be accessible. They must be practical. Reading is a skill that can improve at any age, but only if shame is removed, and only if instruction is clear. Technology can support literacy. It cannot replace instruction. Apps can reinforce skills. They cannot build them from scratch. Without guidance, technology becomes distraction. With guidance, it becomes amplification. The difference is human intention. Even the best methods fail without trained teachers. Many educators were never taught how to teach reading effectively. They were taught theories. They were given scripts. They were not given mastery. Fixing literacy requires retraining at scale. This is expensive. It is time-consuming. And it is unavoidable. Literacy cannot be fixed quietly. It requires public honesty. It requires acknowledging failure. It requires rejecting comforting myths. The idea that all learning should feel easy. The idea that struggle is harmful. The idea that standards are oppressive. None of these survive contact with reality. Every year of delay widens the gap. Every cohort carries the burden forward. The longer systems resist change, the harder change becomes. Literacy is foundational. Without it, every other reform collapses. Literacy is foundational. Without it, every other reform collapses. What comes next? So far, This story has focused on students and systems. But there is another crisis running parallel. The people responsible for holding everything together are leaving. The next part examines why teachers are quitting, what that means for literacy, and why replacing them is not as simple as hiring more bodies. A literacy crisis cannot be separated from a teacher crisis. One feeds the other. As reading outcomes decline, pressure increases. As pressure increases, teachers leave. As teachers leave, outcomes fall even further. This cycle is not accidental. It is structural. Public debate often frames the problem as individual failure. Lazy teachers, outdated teachers, teachers who just don't care. This framing is convenient. It avoids accountability for the system itself. Most teachers enter the profession motivated, idealistic, and deeply invested in student success. They do not quit because they stop caring. They quit because caring becomes unsustainable. Teaching has always been demanding. What changed is the emotional load. Teachers are now expected to be educators, counselors, behavior managers, tech support, and crisis responders at the same time. They manage trauma they were never trained to treat. They absorb anger from parents, administrators, and politicians. They do this while being evaluated primarily through test scores they do not fully control. Burnout is not exhaustion. It is the erosion of meaning. One of the least discussed drivers of teacher exits is student behavior. Classrooms have become harder to manage. Disruptions are more frequent. Consequences are less consistent. Teachers are often instructed to tolerate behaviors that would have once removed a student from class. This makes teaching reading nearly impossible. Literacy instruction requires focus. Decoding requires quiet. Practice requires repetition. Chaos destroys all three. In some schools, teachers do not just manage disruption. They manage fear, violent incidents, threats, unpredictable outbursts. Many educators quietly admit they do not feel safe. This reality rarely makes it into policy discussions, but it dominates daily experience. No instructional method can succeed in an unsafe environment. Low compensation matters. Teachers earn less than similarly educated professionals. They often work unpaid hours. They fund classroom supplies themselves. But pay alone does not explain the exodus. Many teachers say they would stay for less money if conditions improved. Respect, autonomy, and support matter just as much. Teachers are buried in paperwork, documentation, compliance tasks, meetings about meetings. Every new initiative adds layers. Few are ever removed. Time spent proving work replaces time doing work. Literacy instruction suffers first. It is easier to cut reading time than compliance time. Classrooms have become battlegrounds. Curriculum debates, policy mandates, public scrutiny. Teachers are expected to navigate political tension while remaining neutral and calm. They are blamed from all sides. Support erodes. Trust disappears. And the profession loses its sense of dignity. Many assume teacher shortages can be solved with recruitment. Hire more. Lower barriers. Accelerate certification. This misunderstands the problem. Teaching quality matters, especially for literacy. Reading instruction requires skill, experience, judgment. Losing veteran teachers creates gaps that cannot be filled quickly, and new teachers are more likely to quit early. When teachers leave, consistency disappears. Programs change. Students lose continuity. Reading gaps widen. This increases pressure on remaining teachers, which pushes more out. The cycle accelerates. The system relies on teacher sacrifice, emotional labor, personal expense, moral obligation. When that supply runs out, collapse follows. Not loudly, quietly, through attrition. So far, we have examined how students struggle to learn to read and why teachers are leaving. But there is another layer. The long-term consequences of low literacy ripple far beyond classrooms. They reshape the economy, democracy, and personal lives. The next part explores what happens when a society loses its ability to read deeply, think critically, and sustain attention. Literacy is not just the ability to read words. It is the ability to understand systems, to evaluate claims, to follow long chains of reasoning. When literacy declines, the damage spreads quietly and everywhere. Low literacy limits job mobility. Workers struggle with manuals, training materials, and digital platforms. Errors increase. Productivity falls. Wages stagnate. Employers compensate by simplifying tasks or automating roles. This creates fewer opportunities for advancement. The economy adapts downward. Modern life requires constant reading. Forms, contracts, medical instructions, digital interfaces. When adults cannot comfortably read, they avoid complexity. They skip information. They rely on others. They become vulnerable to mistakes and exploitation. This affects health outcomes, financial decisions, legal rights. A functioning democracy requires informed citizens. Voters must read policy summaries, compare arguments, understand consequences. Low literacy reduces participation. People disengage not because they do not care, but because comprehension feels overwhelming. Simplified slogans replace analysis. Emotion replaces evidence. When reading stamina is low, people rely on headlines, clips, sound bites. This creates ideal conditions for misinformation. Nuance disappears. False certainty spreads. Algorithms reward outrage. Critical thinking weakens. Struggling readers often hide it. Shame replaces curiosity. Avoidance becomes a coping strategy. Over time, people stop trying. This affects self-worth, confidence, identity. A society full of quiet avoidance cannot innovate. Short-form content trains shallow attention. Rapid scrolling replaces deep focus. Reading becomes effortful instead of rewarding. The brain adapts. This makes long texts feel unbearable, which further reduces practice. The cycle reinforces itself. Literacy loss is gradual, invisible. There is no single collapse moment. By the time outcomes are obvious, habits are entrenched. Children grow into adults with the same gaps, and adults rarely return to foundational reading skills. A low-literacy society is easier to manage. Simpler messages, fewer questions, less resistance. This is not necessarily intentional, but it is convenient, which is why reform is slow. The situation is not irreversible. Brains remain plastic. Reading skills can be rebuilt. Teachers can be supported. Instruction can change, but it requires honesty. About methods, about expectations, about screens, about priorities. We have explored how literacy declines, why teachers leave, and what happens when reading fades from a culture. The final part brings everything together. What it would take to reverse this trend, and whether the country is willing to do it. By this point, the problem seems obvious. If phonics-based instruction works better, why not just switch back to it everywhere? If screen time hurts reading, why not reduce it? If teachers are burning out, why not support them more? The reason change has been slow is not because the solutions are unknown. It is because education systems are built like massive ships. They do not turn quickly, and every attempted correction collides with politics, bureaucracy, identity, and fear. One of the biggest obstacles is that reading instruction is deeply emotional. Parents assume that if their child struggles, someone must be at fault. Teachers feel blamed when methods are criticized, even if those methods were mandated from above. Administrators fear lawsuits, public backlash, or sudden drops in test scores during transitions. So systems choose stability over effectiveness. Even when evidence mounts that something is not working, schools often double down rather than admit error. Changing instructional philosophy means retraining staff, rewriting curricula, and acknowledging that millions of students were underserved. That admission carries political and legal risk. As a result, reform happens slowly, unevenly, and often too late for the students currently passing through the system. Curriculum does not change at the classroom level first. It changes at the top. States approve materials years in advance. Districts sign contracts that lock them in. Teachers are required to follow pacing guides even when they know something is not working. Deviating can mean poor evaluations or disciplinary action. This creates a strange reality where teachers may privately believe phonics works better, but publicly teach something else. New teachers inherit systems they did not design and are expected to execute them perfectly. When results fall short, the blame often lands on the classroom instead of the framework. Many teacher preparation programs failed to adapt. For decades, future teachers were taught that reading would emerge naturally with exposure. Phonics was framed as rigid or outdated. Graduates entered classrooms without a deep understanding of how decoding actually works in the brain. When those teachers struggled, they were given more strategies instead of better foundations. Intervention piled on top of confusion. Even today, Many educators report that they learn more about reading science on their own than through formal training. Technology was introduced as a solution. Tablets promised engagement. Educational apps promised personalization. Screens were supposed to close gaps. Instead, they often replaced the slow, effortful process of reading with passive consumption. Clicking feels like learning, but it rarely builds decoding strength. Videos feel educational, but they bypass the very skills struggling readers need most. Schools are now deeply invested in technology infrastructure. Walking it back feels like admitting wasted time and money. So screens stay. The third grade reading pivot remains one of the most critical pressure points in education. Before that year, children are taught how to read. After it, they are expected to read in order to learn everything else. Science, history, math problems, instructions, tests, all become text-heavy overnight. If a child enters that year without solid reading skills, the gap widens fast. Catch-up becomes remediation instead of growth. This is where many students emotionally disengage. They stop raising their hands. They stop volunteering answers. They begin to believe school is not for them. Once that belief sets in, academic recovery becomes much harder. Low literacy quietly drains productivity. Workers take longer to train. Errors increase. Communication breaks down. Entire industries shift toward automation not because humans are incapable, but because reading-intensive roles shrink. Healthcare outcomes worsen when patients cannot fully understand instructions. Financial decisions suffer when contracts and disclosures go unread or misunderstood. These costs do not show up on school budgets, but they ripple through society. As teachers leave, class sizes grow. As class sizes grow, individual reading instruction becomes harder. As instruction weakens, student frustration rises. As behavior worsens, more teachers leave. This feedback loop accelerates decline. New teachers often enter underprepared, overloaded, and unsupported. Many leave within a few years. Stability disappears. Relationships suffer. Learning slows. Schools become places of constant transition instead of growth. This crisis is not caused by bad intentions. It is caused by systems that reward compliance over correction. Fixing literacy requires humility. It requires admitting mistakes, slowing down instruction, retraining educators, and prioritizing fundamentals over appearances. Those changes are disruptive, but avoiding them is far more expensive. The question is no longer whether literacy matters. The question is whether society is willing to do the uncomfortable work required to rebuild it. Because once reading declines beyond a certain point, recovery becomes exponentially harder, and the cost of waiting keeps rising. If this story ended with panic, it would be incomplete. The truth is that literacy can be rebuilt. Teacher burnout can be reduced. Reading levels can recover, but only if expectations shift from quick fixes to long-term repair. Real recovery does not start with slogans, new apps, or emergency programs. It starts with accepting something deeply uncomfortable. There is no shortcut to learning how to read well. There never has been. Reading is not absorbed. It is built. That means any serious solution has to slow down, simplify, and return to fundamentals that feel almost boring in a culture obsessed with speed. The first change is instructional honesty. Children must be explicitly taught how written language works. That means phonics is not optional or supplemental. It is foundational. Letters represent sounds. Sounds blend into words. Words become sentences. Sentences build meaning. This instruction must be systematic, consistent, and repeated until mastery is automatic. Not guessed, not inferred, not memorized by sight. That alone would dramatically reduce reading failure. But it cannot stop there. Students must also read far more than they currently do. Real books, printed text, long passages that require attention. Reading stamina must be rebuilt the same way physical endurance is rebuilt, slowly and intentionally. Screens should support learning, not replace it. When technology removes effort, it also removes growth. Waiting until children fall behind is the most expensive strategy possible. The earlier reading struggles are addressed, the easier they are to fix. Before third grade, the brain is still highly flexible. After that point, intervention becomes slower, heavier, and more emotionally charged. This means schools must prioritize early literacy above nearly everything else. Smaller reading groups, more trained specialists, fewer distractions. fewer competing initiatives. If a system claims to value equity but does not guarantee early reading proficiency, it is failing its most vulnerable students. Teachers do not leave because they dislike teaching. They leave because teaching has become unsustainable. Reducing burnout does not require heroics. It requires structure, clear expectations, real support for discipline, fewer administrative demands that do not improve learning. Teachers need time to plan, time to teach, and time to recover emotionally from a job that increasingly asks them to act as educators, counselors, social workers, and security staff all at once. Pay matters. Respect matters more. Autonomy matters most. When teachers are trusted as professionals instead of micromanaged as liabilities, retention improves. Even the best reforms fail if the culture surrounding education does not change. Reading must once again be seen as essential, not optional. Effort must be praised, not avoided. Struggle must be normalized, not pathologized. Children cannot believe reading matters if adults around them rarely read. Families matter here. Communities matter. Media habits matter. Literacy does not live only in schools. It lives in homes, routines, expectations, and role modeling. If nothing changes, the consequences will not arrive suddenly. They will arrive quietly. More adults who avoid reading-intensive work. More reliance on automation not because it is better, but because it is easier. More misinformation absorbed without skepticism. More citizens excluded from full participation in society. This is not just an education issue. It is a civic one. Every generation inherits the systems it is willing to tolerate. The question now is simple and uncomfortable. Do we want a future where fewer people can read deeply, think independently, and engage fully with the world around them? Or are we willing to slow down, rebuild the basics, and accept that real learning takes time? Because literacy is not just a skill. It is the foundation of everything that comes after. And once it erodes far enough, rebuilding it becomes harder than anyone expects. Don't forget to subscribe on your way out. See you next video.